In this video, I want to talk clearly about what we actually know, what we can reasonably infer, and what still remains uncertain regarding the new standard banner character people are associating with version 6.4. This is not a kit breakdown, not a banner countdown, and not a hype piece. The goal here is to walk through where this character comes from in the story, why players are reacting the way they are, why the standard banner context matters so much after past decisions, and what kind of role this character could logically fill, based on Genshin's long-term design patterns. If you have only seen fragments of discussion or screenshots without context, this video should give you a clean mental picture of the situation by the end. For the past few days, discussion around version 6.4 has quietly shifted away from flashy trailers or headline characters and towards something much more subtle: the possibility of a new standard banner character entering the game. That alone would already be notable, because standard editions are rare and usually loaded with long-term implications. But what really caught people's attention is who this character might be and, more importantly, who he is not. The name at the center of this conversation is Lohen. Unlike many speculative characters who appear only in data strings or vague rumors, Lohen already exists in the game's narrative space. He is directly mentioned by Varka during the Archon Quest Song of the Welkin Moon, Act 4, an elegy for faded moonlight. Varka refers to him by name, speaks about him in the present tense, and describes him as someone even tougher than himself. That alone establishes Lohen as an active, capable figure within the Knights of Favonius, not a historical footnote or background lore detail. According to in-game dialogue and established lore references, Lohen holds the position of vice-captain of the Knights of Favonius' 5th Company. The captain of that company remains unknown, but what matters here is that the 5th Company accompanied Varka on his expedition toward Nodkree. After the Wild Hunt incident, parts of that company began returning to Mansot. This places Lohen in a very specific narrative category, a high-ranking expedition knight who exists just outside the main playable cast, but close enough to be narratively relevant. This matters because Genshin has a very clear historical pattern when it comes to standard banner characters. Standard characters tend to fall into one of two groups. Either they are early game foundational characters tied to the core regions, or they are later additions who exist slightly outside the main story spotlight. They are rarely the emotional centerpiece of an Archon quest, and they are almost never marketed heavily before release. When that pattern is broken, the community reaction tends to be intense. That context explains why so many player reactions are less about excitement for Lohen himself and more about relief. There was a moment where people genuinely feared that Varka, a character built up since early Mondstadt lore, could end up in the standard pool. The idea of that happening after previous controversies is enough to cause instant panic. Once the conversation shifted toward Lohen instead, the tone changed immediately. Not because players dislike Lohen, but because placing a lower profile, but still canon character into standard fits the pattern people expect the game to follow. Now, this reaction cannot be separated from what happened in the past. The D situation permanently altered how players interpret standard banner decisions. D appeared in promotional material, had strong story presence, and carried clear narrative importance, yet still entered the standard pool that created a sense of disconnect between narrative importance and banner value. Since then, players have been far more sensitive to where characters land, especially when they carry lore weight. Lohen sits in a very specific middle ground. He is important enough to be named by Varka and tied to the expedition, but he has not been visually revealed, marketed, or emotionally centered in a quest arc. That makes him feel like a safer candidate for standard placement, at least in the eyes of the community. This does not mean he is guaranteed to be standard, and it does not mean he will even be playable in the near future. What it does mean is that players can imagine this outcome without feeling that the story is being undermined. Another layer to the discussion is element and role speculation. A lot of players are projecting hopes onto Lohen rather than expectations. There has been a long-standing absence of a JO standard character, and Mondstadt still lacks Dendro representation entirely. That naturally leads to speculation, but it is important to be careful here. Story role does not reliably predict element. Combat role does not reliably predict banner placement, and standard does not automatically mean weak, even though that fear exists. Historically, standard characters tend to offer broad utility rather than niche specialization. They are often designed to be flexible across many team structures rather than optimized for one specific damage rotation. That leads to discussions about whether Lohen could function as a support, a healer, or a defensive unit rather than a pure damage dealer. If he is tied to expedition forces and field operations, it would make sense for his kit to emphasize survivability, team sustain, or battlefield control rather than raw personal damage output. That is speculation, not a claim, but it is consistent with how Genshin usually frames characters in similar roles. There is also anxiety about release packing. The idea of multiple new 5-star characters appearing close together raises concerns about primogem pressure, especially when Genshin's income packing has historically been more conservative than newer titles. Even if one of those characters enters the standard pool, the psychological impact of faster releases still affects how players feel about saving, pulling, and long-term planning. What makes this situation interesting is that the conversation around Lohen is less about his personality or design and more about trust. Players are watching to see whether the game continues to respect the boundary it appears to have re-established between narrative importance and standard banner placement. Lohen as a vice captain who exists in dialogue, but not in marketing, feels like a test case for that philosophy. At the same time, it is worth remembering that dialogue mentions alone do not guarantee playability. Genshin has introduced many named ranked characters who never became playable units. Until there is official presentation, everything remains uncertain. Treating speculation as speculation is important, especially when emotions around banner placement run high. So the real question is not is Lohen coming in 6.44, but rather if Genshin adds another standard character, what kind of character should that be? Should it be someone deeply embedded in the main emotional arc, or someone who expands the world quietly while reinforcing the foundation of the roster? Lohen fits the second option far more cleanly, which is why the idea resonates with so many players. And that leads to an interesting discussion point. If Lohen does eventually become playable, what would you personally want from a standard character at this stage of the game? A reliable support with long-term value, a defensive unit that enables underused archetypes, or a simple, solid character that ages gracefully without dominating the meta? That answer probably says more about how you experience Genshin than any leak ever could. If you want more breakdowns like this, where speculation is separated from what exists in-game and discussed calmly instead of chased for hype, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments what role you think a future standard character should actually serve, because that conversation matters more than any single name or patch number.